Modern history is built on a quiet assumption that civilization develops slowly, that humans move from primitive to complex through gradual accumulation of tools, ideas, and institutions, that writing follows counting, that cities follow villages, that astronomy follows agriculture, and that advanced mathematics arrives only after long periods of trial and error. This assumption works until the archaeological record refuses to cooperate. Because the earliest civilization we can clearly identify does not look like an early experiment, it does not resemble a rough draft of human organization. It appears already complete. Around the late 4th millennium BCE, in the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a civilization emerges with no clear developmental runway. Not a scattered collection of farming hamlets, but fully realized urban centers. Not symbolic markings, but a functional writing system capable of recording law, astronomy, trade, theology, and mathematics from its earliest examples. This civilization called itself Sumer. Within a short archaeological window, Sumer displays characteristics that should not coexist at a beginning point. Large-scale irrigation systems coordinated across entire regions. Standardized weights and measures enforced across cities. Multi-story architecture, planned street layouts, and administrative districts. Legal codes. Professional scribal schools. Astronomical calendars aligned to planetary motion. Most civilizations show their learning curve in the ground. Crude tools beneath refined ones. Simple dwellings beneath complex structures. Experimental forms preceding optimized designs. Sumer shows almost none of this. Its earliest layers already contain optimized systems. The writing system, cuneiform, does not begin as pictographs and gradually abstract. It appears rapidly as a mixed phonetic and logographic system capable of encoding speech, numbers, and technical instruction. Its numerical system is not base 10, but base 60, a structure so mathematically efficient that it still governs how modern civilization measures time and space. Their metallurgy shows controlled alloy production rather than accidental discovery. Their medical texts describe surgical procedures, including cranial operations, with practical detail. Their astronomical records track lunar cycles, planetary movements, and long-term celestial patterns that require sustained observation across centuries. This is not what a civilization inventing itself looks like. It is what a civilization restoring itself looks like. The Sumerians themselves did not claim to be first. In their own records, administrative, not poetic, they state something unusual. Authority does not originate with humans. Kingship descends. It arrives already formed. This phrase appears repeatedly across centuries of Sumerian inscriptions with minimal variation. Kingship descended from heaven. After the flood, kingship descended again. These are not metaphors embedded in mythic epics. They are formulaic declarations placed at the beginning of chronological lists and institutional records. The most striking of these records is what modern scholars call the Sumerian king list. Preserved in multiple copies from different cities, the list attempts something modern historiography would avoid entirely. It treats pre-catastrophe rulers and post-catastrophe rulers as part of the same historical sequence. The list begins before the flood. It names kings whose reigns last not decades or centuries, but tens of thousands of years, calculated in precise numerical units. These numbers are not random. They follow structured ratios tied to Sumerian cosmology and mathematics. Each reign is recorded individually. Each total is summed. Then the list marks a boundary. The flood swept over the land. Afterward, kingship descended again, and reign lengths shortened dramatically. Still long, but clearly operating under different conditions. The text does not explain this change. It does not apologize for it. It simply records it. Modern interpretations often dismiss the early reigns as symbolic or mythological. But symbolism does not usually obey mathematical consistency across independent copies. And myth does not normally preserve accounting discipline. What the Sumerians appear to be doing is preserving a memory of a world that operated under different constraints, biological, environmental, or technological, before a global disruption altered the conditions of civilization. This pattern does not exist in isolation. Flood narratives appear across hundreds of cultures worldwide, often with striking technical similarities, not vague tales of punishment, but structured accounts of water rise, duration, survival strategies, and reconstruction. Boats built to exact specifications, animals preserved, knowledge carried forward. Geology confirms that such a catastrophe is not only possible, but likely. At the end of the last ice age, global sea levels rose by more than 100 meters. Entire continental shelves, areas ideal for early civilization, were submerged. Regions that would have supported large populations disappeared beneath the oceans. The Younger Dryas event introduced abrupt climate instability, massive flooding, wildfires, and ecosystem collapse. Human populations were compressed into survival mode. Any advanced social structure would have been stripped down to essentials within generations. If a civilization existed before this event, one capable of agriculture, astronomy, construction, and long-term planning, it would not leave obvious ruins on land today. Its core territories would be underwater. What would survive is not architecture. What would survive is memory. Fragments of systems, numbers without context, myths preserving structure. The Sumerians appear to be standing on the edge of such memory. Their texts repeatedly reference beings called the Anunnaki, described not as abstract gods, but as organized agents who establish cities, assign kings, teach agriculture, regulate water, and transmit law. Whether interpreted literally, symbolically, or institutionally, their function remains consistent. They represent continuity across a rupture. They are the carriers of order from a prior age. This same role appears elsewhere under different names. In Egypt, the gods rule before dynasties. In India, previous yugas end in destruction and renewal. In Mesoamerica, earlier worlds are destroyed before the current one begins. In Greece, Plato preserves Egyptian accounts of a lost advanced society, destroyed by flood long before classical history. Different cultures, same structure. Civilization is not born once, it recurs. Each recurrence begins smaller than the last, rebuilding from fragments that survive catastrophe. Over time, complexity returns, confidence grows, memory fades. Eventually, civilization forgets that it has fallen before. The Sumerians had not forgotten. Their obsession with cycles, numbers, and astronomical time suggests a worldview shaped by repetition rather than progress. They measured history not in generations, but in cosmic intervals. They embedded long-term celestial mechanics into their mathematics and calendars. Civilizations that think this way are not concerned with novelty. They are concerned with recurrence. Which leads to a question the Sumerians never answer directly, but quietly imply. If their civilization emerged after a flood, and if kingship descended again rather than originating, then Sumer itself was not the first. It was a restoration. And if restorations occur repeatedly, then the present moment may not be exceptional at all. It may simply be the latest stable phase in a cycle that has played out before, rising, collapsing, and restarting under slightly altered conditions. Understanding that cycle requires moving beyond myth and into structure. Not what ancient people believed, but what they recorded. To understand what the Sumerians believed about their place in time, it is necessary to look not at their myths first, but at their records. Sumerian civilization left behind tens of thousands of clay tablets, many of them mundane by design. These were not ceremonial texts or epic poems intended to inspire belief. They were inventories, contracts, calendars, instructional manuals, legal rulings, and administrative logs. They exist because bureaucracy requires memory. And memory, once fixed in clay, resists reinterpretation. Among these documents is a recurring idea that appears so consistently it becomes difficult to dismiss as metaphor. Kingship is not invented by humans. It is transferred. The phrase appears repeatedly in Sumerian inscriptions in nearly identical form. Kingship descended from heaven. After the flood, kingship descended again. The wording is precise, formulaic, and repeated across centuries. It is not poetic variation. It is institutional language. What matters is not whether heaven is interpreted literally or symbolically. What matters is that authority, order, and structure are described as originating elsewhere and arriving already formed. Human rulers do not create the system. They receive it. This framing becomes more significant when examined alongside the Sumerian king list, a document preserved in multiple versions across different city-states and time periods. While the copies differ in some details, their structure remains consistent, suggesting an authoritative source tradition rather than local invention. The list begins not with the founding of cities, but with a declaration. When kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu. Then come the names: Alulim, Alalgar, Enmen-Lu-Ana, Enmen-Gal-Ana, each associated with reigns measured not in years, but in vast numerical spans, tens of thousands of years per ruler, calculated using a unit called the Sar. These numbers are internally consistent. They are mathematically structured. They are not rounded, exaggerated, or vague. Modern scholarship often resolves this discomfort by asserting that these reigns symbolize dynasties rather than individuals. But the text does not say this. It lists rulers sequentially, assigns each a specific reign length, and then totals them. Symbolism rarely behaves this way. After the final pre-flood king, the text marks a transition. The flood swept over the land. Kingship was taken away. Then, after the flood, kingship descended again, this time to Kish. The reign lengths collapsed dramatically. Hundreds of years instead of tens of thousands. Still long by modern standards, but clearly operating under different conditions. The Sumerians themselves recognized this as a break. They did not treat pre-flood time as myth and post-flood time as history. They treated both as history, separated by a catastrophe that altered the structure of the world. This distinction is reinforced elsewhere in their literature. Flood. Narratives preserved in Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Babylonian texts describe not only destruction, but technical survival. The hero builds a vessel according to exact dimensions. He seals it with pitch. He loads specific animals, tools, and supplies. The text reads, less like allegory and more like instruction remembered. What is often missed is that these flood accounts are not isolated. They sit alongside administrative texts that show advanced knowledge appearing immediately after the supposed reset. Writing, metallurgy, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine all appear in mature form within a narrow archaeological window. There is no long developmental trail leading up to them. The base 16 numerical system appears fully implemented. Astronomical tables track planetary motion with precision that requires centuries of observation. Medical texts describe surgical procedures, including cranial operations, with practical detail. Metallurgical instructions specify alloy ratios that, modern materials, science recognizes as optimal. This combination is difficult to reconcile with a civilization inventing everything from scratch. It makes far more sense in a continuity model, one in which knowledge survives disruption in reduced form and is reconstituted under favorable conditions. The Sumerians themselves hint at this continuity through their references to the Anunnaki. Modern treatments often collapse the Anunnaki into the category of gods and stop there. But Sumerian texts do not describe them as abstract forces or symbolic principles. They describe them as a group with hierarchy, division of labor, and specific functions tied to governance, agriculture, water management, and law. They are said to establish cities, set boundaries, assign kings, and teach arts. They convene councils. They argue. They withdraw. Whether one interprets these descriptions literally, symbolically, or somewhere in between, the structural role remains the same. The Anunnaki represent a prior organizing intelligence responsible for transmitting civilization-level systems. In other words, they function as carriers of continuity across a rupture. This role becomes clearer when Sumerian records are placed alongside parallel traditions elsewhere. In Egypt, the earliest dynasties speak of a time when gods ruled before humans. In Mesoamerica, creation myths describe previous worlds destroyed and remade. In India, vast yuga cycles measure the rise and decline of civilization across immense spans of time. In Greece, Plato preserves an Egyptian account of a technologically advanced society destroyed by flood long before classical antiquity. These are not identical stories, but they share a structure, a prior age, advanced knowledge, catastrophic destruction, survival of fragments, reconstruction. The consistency of this structure across independent cultures suggests that it is not a random narrative invention. It is a memory pattern. Geology supports the possibility. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose more than 100 meters. Entire coastal plains vanished. Regions that would have been ideal for early civilization, fertile, temperate, river-fed, are now underwater. Any cities built there would leave little trace accessible to modern archaeology. The Younger Dryas event, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions around 12,900 years ago, introduced abrupt climate instability, massive flooding, wildfires, and species extinctions. Human populations were forced into survival mode. Complexity would have collapsed quickly. If an advanced civilization existed prior to this event, even one comparable to early industrial levels, it could have been erased within a few generations, leaving only distorted memory and isolated technological remnants. The Sumerians appear to have known this. Their emphasis on cycles is not philosophical abstraction. It is numerical, astronomical, calendar-based. They tracked the precession of the equinoxes, a slow wobble in Earth's rotational axis that completes a full cycle roughly every 25,120 years. Detecting this requires not only observation, but record continuity across centuries. Calculating it requires mathematics far beyond what is expected from a first civilization. Yet Sumerian numbers embed this cycle repeatedly. So do later traditions. The number 432,000 appears in Sumerian flood chronologies, Hindu yuga durations, and even Norse myth. These are not cultural coincidences. They are scaled expressions of the same astronomical rhythm. Civilizations that track time in this way are not thinking in terms of centuries. They are thinking in terms of resets. And that brings the question back to the present. If Sumer was a restoration after a collapse, and if other civilizations followed similar arcs, then modern civilization is not unique in its complexity. It is unique only in its confidence. Confidence that this time is different. That technology guarantees continuity. That collapse belongs to the past. But cycles do not care about confidence. They operate according to forces larger than belief. Planetary mechanics, climate thresholds, resource limits, and systemic fragility. The Sumerians did not record cycles to predict the future. They recorded them to remember the past. And memory, in their worldview, was the only defense against repetition. Once the idea of recurrence is taken seriously, a different question replaces the familiar one. Not when did civilization begin, but how many times has it happened? Ancient cultures did not treat this as speculation. They treated it as record. Across independent traditions, separated by geography, language, and millennia, early sources repeatedly describe humanity as existing within a sequence of worlds, ages, or creations. These sequences are not infinite. They are counted. And strikingly often, they converge on the same terminal structure. 7. This is not numerology in the modern sense. It is enumeration. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the structure of reality is layered. 7 heavens, 7 divine judges, 7 decrees that establish order. These are not symbolic flourishes. They are administrative divisions of the cosmos, mirrored in how Sumerian society organized authority and ritual. Egyptian traditions describe a sequence of divine and semi-divine rulers before the historical dynasties. The earliest king lists do not begin with human pharaohs, but with gods, then demigods, then the first mortal rulers. This sequence is not open-ended. It progresses through defined stages before stabilizing into the historical era. In India, the structure is explicit. Time unfolds through cycles of creation and destruction, subdivided into ages that follow precise mathematical ratios. Entire humanities rise and fall within these cycles. The texts do not speak of one lost world, but of several, each separated by catastrophic transitions that reset the conditions of life. Mesoamerican traditions describe previous suns, complete worlds that ended through fire, wind, flood, or earthquake. The current world is never described as the first. It is described as the one that survived long enough to forget the others. Indigenous traditions in North America preserve similar frameworks. The Hopi speak of earlier worlds destroyed when balance was lost. Each world ends differently. Each transition leaves survivors who rebuild under new rules. The present world is not permanent. It is provisional. What makes these accounts difficult to dismiss is not their mythic language, but their structural agreement. They all describe multiple prior worlds or civilizations, destruction through natural or cosmic forces, survival of a remnant, re-establishment of order, gradual loss of memory, and they all treat the current era as late in the sequence, not early. The recurrence of 7 within these frameworks deserves careful attention. 7 is not used as an infinite symbol. It is used as a boundary. In several traditions, the 7th phase marks completion, transition, or instability, rather than permanence. It is the point at which accumulation gives way to reset. In Mesopotamian thought, 7 is associated with judgment and reckoning. In Near Eastern traditions, 7-day cycles govern creation and rest, activity and cessation. The structure implies that continuity has limits. In Indian cosmology, while time cycles extend far beyond 7 units, human development is often described in layered phases that culminate before renewal. Later esoteric interpretations synthesize these ideas into 7 major stages of humanity, each separated by collapse. Even in Greco-Roman philosophy, history is not linear. Authors describe ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, stages of decline rather than ascent. Roman writers preserve the idea that their era is not the beginning, but the residue of something older and more refined. What these traditions share is an assumption that complexity is unstable over long time horizons. Civilization builds until it reaches a threshold. Beyond that point, internal complexity becomes fragility. Systems interlock so tightly that disruption propagates rapidly. Environmental stress, climatic shifts, or astronomical events act as triggers rather than causes. Collapse follows not because people forget how to build, but because conditions no longer support what was built. When this happens, survival favors simplicity. Large cities fail, specialized knowledge disappears, trade networks collapse. What remains are portable skills, adaptable practices, and fragments of knowledge that can be encoded in story, ritual, or symbol. Over time, these fragments are misunderstood, mythologized, or ritualized. Their original function fades, but their structure persists. This is why numbers survive. Ratios, cycles, calendars. They are easier to preserve than explanations. The Sumerians appear to have inherited such fragments. Their obsession with numerical order, with dividing time into precise units, and with tracking celestial cycles far longer than a human lifetime suggests a culture acutely aware of impermanence. They were not recording time for convenience. They were anchoring memory against loss. When they separated pre-flood and post-flood kings, they were not inventing myth. They were marking a discontinuity they believed was real, and they were not unique. If multiple civilizations independently preserve the idea that humanity has passed through several major iterations, then the question becomes one of convergence. Why this number? One possibility is that 7 reflects an astronomical or geophysical cycle, a count of stable climatic windows within a larger process. Ice ages, interglacial periods, magnetic reversals, and orbital variations all operate on long timelines that periodically destabilize the conditions required for complex society. Another possibility is that 7 reflects observational limits, the number of cycles that could be remembered, recorded, or reconstructed before memory degraded entirely, or it may reflect something simpler, that by the 7th recurrence, the pattern becomes visible. Only after repetition does structure emerge. If this is the case, then modern civilization may not be exceptional for its technology, but for its documentation. Satellites, sensors, digital archives, and global communication networks record the present moment with unprecedented fidelity. But fidelity does not guarantee continuity. Complex systems fail in complex ways. The more interdependent a civilization becomes, the fewer local failures it can absorb. A disruption in energy, climate, or information cascades across the entire structure. Previous civilizations likely collapsed regionally, leaving other regions intact. Modern civilization is global. Its failure modes are correspondingly synchronized. This is not prophecy. It is systems theory. The Sumerians did not predict how a cycle would end. They recorded that it did. They did not describe apocalypse. They described transition. And they positioned themselves not as originators, but as inheritors, custodians of a fragile interval between catastrophes. If their records are even partially accurate, then modern humanity may not be the culmination of history. It may be the 7th iteration to reach a comparable level of complexity before encountering the same structural limits. What comes next, according to every ancient framework, is not extinction. It is reduction, a narrowing of scale, a loss of complexity, a return to survivable forms, and eventually, if the cycle permits, another rebuilding. Whether this interpretation is accepted or rejected is less important than what it reveals. That ancient civilizations thought in terms of recurrence, not destiny, and that they believed the greatest threat to civilization was not ignorance, but forgetting that it had failed before. The most common objection to the idea of multiple prior civilizations is simple and intuitive. If advanced societies existed before recorded history, where are the ruins? The question assumes that collapse leaves debris in the same way that abandonment does. It assumes that cities fall slowly, that structures remain standing long enough to be buried gently, and that time preserves rather than erases. The geological record does not support this assumption. Civilization is fragile not because it is weak, but because it is concentrated. It clusters near water, along coasts, beside rivers, and across fertile plains. These are precisely the regions most vulnerable to long-term environmental change. At the peak of the last ice age, global sea levels were between 100 and 140 meters lower than they are today. Vast areas of continental shelf were exposed. These regions were not marginal. They were among the most habitable landscapes on Earth. Stable climates, abundant fresh water, rich soils, and access to marine resources made them ideal for large, sedentary populations. When the climate warmed, these lands did not erode gradually. They flooded. As ice sheets melted, sea levels rose in pulses, sometimes meters within a human lifetime. Coastlines shifted inward. River valleys became bays. Settlements were submerged, dismantled by wave action, buried under sediment, or broken apart by currents. Stone collapses, wood rots, metal corrodes. Within a few centuries, even large cities can vanish completely beneath the sea. This process does not leave behind dramatic ruins. It leaves negative space. The absence of evidence becomes the evidence. This is why archaeology is biased toward inland and elevated sites. What survives is what was built away from water or reused continuously. What disappears is what was drowned. The Sumerians lived at the inland edge of a memory. Their flood narratives do not describe a minor regional disaster. They describe a boundary between worlds, a before and an after. And they locate the destruction not inland, but toward the sea. This aligns with geology. The Persian Gulf, today a shallow body of water, was once a vast river valley fed by multiple major rivers. During periods of low sea level, it would have been one of the most fertile regions on the planet. As sea levels rose, it flooded gradually but relentlessly, forcing populations northward. What survives are the settlements built after the retreat. The same pattern appears globally. In Southeast Asia, the Sunda Shelf connected modern Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand into a single landmass. This region supported large human populations for tens of thousands of years. Today it lies underwater. In the Americas, coastal plains now submerged would have supported dense populations. Inland sites represent only what retreated survived. In Europe, the North Sea once covered Doggerland, a habitable landscape larger than modern Britain. Archaeological dredging has recovered tools, bones, and artifacts from its seabed. Entire cultures vanished beneath the water. Collapse does not always leave monuments. Sometimes it leaves only silence. The Younger Dryas event demonstrates how quickly such silence can descend. Around 12,900 years ago, Earth's climate shifted abruptly. Temperatures dropped. Weather patterns destabilized. Massive meltwater pulses altered ocean circulation. Wildfires burned across continents. Species vanished. This was not a slow decline. Ice core data indicates the transition occurred within decades. Human societies that depended on stable seasons, predictable rivers, and long-term planning would have failed rapidly. Agriculture would collapse. Trade would cease. Cities would empty or be destroyed outright. Survival would favor mobility and simplicity. Under such conditions, advanced knowledge does not vanish instantly. It degrades. Specialists die first. Tools break and cannot be replaced. Complex systems fail without maintenance. What remains are fragments. Calendars survive as ritual. Engineering survives as myth. Astronomy survives as story. This is how technological memory becomes symbolic memory. The Sumerians inherited symbols that still carried mathematical precision. Their base 60 system encoded astronomical cycles. Their flood chronologies aligned with long-term celestial rhythms. Their king lists preserved structured time rather than random legend. They were not inventing history, they were compressing it. Archaeology increasingly supports this compression model. Underwater surveys have identified massive stone structures off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean. Some show geometric features difficult to attribute to natural processes. Others reveal harbour-like formations, walls, and platforms at depths that would have been dry land during the last ice age. Dating these sites is difficult, not because they are young, but because they are old and submerged. Organic material is scarce. Stratigraphy is disturbed. But their very location places them outside the window of conventional civilization timelines. Mainstream interpretation often defaults to caution. Natural formation is favored unless certainty is absolute. This is reasonable, but it also ensures that entire categories of evidence remain unresolved indefinitely. Meanwhile, ancient texts describe cities lost beneath the sea with remarkable consistency. These accounts are dismissed as myth because the ruins are difficult to access. The ruins are difficult to access because they are underwater. This circular reasoning preserves the linear model by default. What breaks the circle is systems thinking. Civilizations do not fail evenly. They fail at the margins first. They retreat towards stability. They abandon what cannot be maintained. If a technologically advanced society existed before the last major climatic disruption, its heartlands would now be submerged. Its survivors would rebuild inland, carrying partial knowledge forward. That rebuilding would look exactly like what appears in the archaeological record: sudden sophistication, inherited systems, missing precursors. Sumer fits this profile precisely, not as the origin of civilization, but as a convergence point where memory reassembled under favorable conditions. And if this process has occurred more than once, then earlier cycles would leave even less evidence. Each reset compounds the erasure. Each flood buries the previous flood's debris. This is why the archaeological record thins rapidly the further back it goes. It is not because nothing existed. It is because destruction outpaces preservation. The idea that humanity has passed through multiple advanced phases is not incompatible with science. It is incompatible only with the assumption that absence of ruins implies absence of civilization. Ancient cultures did not make that assumption. They understood that the earth forgets, which is why they embedded memory in numbers, cycles, and stories designed to survive when stone could not. If they were correct, then modern civilization occupies not a permanent summit, but a narrow plateau between collapses. And the question becomes not whether collapse is possible, but whether memory will survive it this time. Ancient civilizations did not look to the sky for inspiration. They looked to it for measurement. For them, the heavens were not symbolic backdrops or spiritual metaphors. They were the largest, most reliable system available for tracking long-term change. The sky did not lie. It did not forget. And most importantly, it moved in cycles far longer than any human life. This is why early civilizations tied the fate of the world to astronomy. They understood something modern culture tends to resist: that Earth does not exist in isolation. Its climate, stability, and habitability are influenced by forces that operate beyond the planet itself. Orbital mechanics, axial tilt, solar output, and cosmic debris fields shape the conditions under which civilization can exist. These forces do not operate smoothly. They oscillate. The most important of these oscillations, and the one most consistently encoded in ancient records, is the precession of the equinoxes. This is the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis, completing one full cycle roughly every 25,920 years. Over this period, the orientation of Earth relative to the stars changes, altering the background constellations behind the Sun at key points in the year. Detecting precession requires patient observation across many generations. Calculating it requires precise mathematics. Encoding it requires cultural continuity. Yet civilizations separated by vast distances all appear to have known it. Sumerian astronomy embeds precessional numbers into its calendrical systems. The same numerical values reappear in later Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Indian, and Mesoamerican traditions, scaled differently but structurally identical. These cultures did not merely observe the sky. They tracked it over time spans that exceeded their own lifetimes. This matters because precession is not just a celestial curiosity. It correlates with changes in Earth's climate system. As axial orientation shifts, solar energy distribution changes subtly but persistently. Over long periods, this contributes to glacial cycles, monsoon intensity, desert expansion, and sea level variation. These are not short-term weather events. They are structural transformations of the environment. Civilization depends on environmental stability. Agriculture requires predictable seasons. Cities require stable coastlines. Trade requires navigable routes. When these shift beyond certain thresholds, complexity becomes a liability rather than an advantage. Ancient civilizations noticed this pattern. They observed that certain celestial configurations coincided with periods of upheaval. They recorded eclipses, conjunctions, and unusual stellar behavior alongside floods, droughts, and political collapse. Over centuries, these correlations accumulated into frameworks that linked the sky to the fate of the Earth. This is the origin of what modern language calls astrology, Though the ancient practice was closer to statistical observation than superstition, it was an attempt to map repeating environmental disruptions to repeating celestial cycles. From this perspective, catastrophe was not random, it was periodic. The Sumerians did not describe the flood as a moral event. They described it as an interval, a transition between regimes of time. Their concern was not punishment, but timing. Later cultures preserved the same logic in different forms. Indian cosmology describes yugas not as spiritual metaphors, but as measured durations, each with characteristic conditions of human behavior and environmental stability. Mesoamerican calendars encode long count cycles that reset after vast spans, not because time ends, but because it turns over. Even in cultures where the language becomes mythic, the structure remains mathematical. Numbers repeat, ratios recur, cycles interlock. This is not accidental. It suggests inheritance. The knowledge required to recognize these cycles is not trivial. It demands sustained observation, record preservation, and mathematical abstraction. These are fragile achievements. They do not survive collapse easily, yet they appear again and again, as if carried forward deliberately. This suggests that at least some groups understood the importance of preserving astronomical knowledge across resets. Not for prediction in the modern sense, but for orientation. To know where one stands in a cycle is to know whether stability is increasing or decreasing. This may explain why ancient civilizations devoted immense resources to building monuments aligned to the sky. Structures like stone circles, pyramids, and temples were not primarily religious in function. They were instruments. They tracked solstices, equinoxes, lunar standstills, and stellar risings. They anchored time to stone when writing might be lost. They allowed future generations to recalibrate their position in a long cycle even after memory had faded. This also explains why so many ancient monuments appear overbuilt relative to their apparent purpose. They were not designed for one generation. They were designed to survive catastrophe. From this perspective, civilization resets are not total erasures. They are partial failures. Enough survives to rebuild, but not enough to remember why things were built the way they were. Each cycle inherits tools without context, numbers without explanation, stories without mechanism. Over time, interpretation replaces understanding. The sky becomes myth again, until someone notices the pattern repeating. If ancient civilizations tied collapse to astronomical cycles, then the question is not whether those cycles still operate. They do. The question is whether modern civilization still tracks them. In many ways, it does not. Modern science understands orbital mechanics, solar cycles, and climate feedback loops in isolation. But it treats them as separate domains rather than integrated systems. It models risk linearly, while the systems themselves are cyclical. Ancient cultures, lacking modern instruments, compensated with long memory. They did not predict exact outcomes. They prepared for recurrence. If they were right, then the present era is not unprecedented. It is positioned somewhere within a long oscillation between stability and disruption. And the danger is not ignorance of technology. It is ignorance of timing. Civilizations do not collapse because they are weak. They collapse because they become efficient. Efficiency concentrates systems. It removes redundancy. It ties survival to continuous operation. What begins as progress gradually transforms into dependency. Early societies could absorb disruption because their systems were simple and local. Food was grown nearby. Skills were distributed broadly. Failure was contained. But as civilization advances, it trades resilience for scale. Production centralizes, expertise narrows, infrastructure interlocks. At a certain threshold, complexity stops being adaptive. It becomes brittle. This is not a moral judgment, it is a structural consequence. The more specialized a system becomes, the more catastrophic its failure modes. A city dependent on distant grain routes collapses faster than a village that grows its own food. A society dependent on uninterrupted energy flows collapses faster than one accustomed to scarcity. A civilization dependent on digital coordination collapses faster than one that can function offline. Advanced civilizations do not fall slowly. They fall suddenly. This pattern appears repeatedly in history, even within the narrow span of recorded time. The Bronze Age collapse did not erase technology gradually. It dismantled trade networks, governance systems, and urban centers within a few generations. Writing vanished in entire regions. Metallurgy regressed. Populations dispersed. What survived were fragments. Knowledge encoded in myth. Techniques preserved in ritual. Calendars remembered as tradition. From the perspective of those who came later, the collapse looked like a dark age. From the perspective of systems theory, it was a reset. Now expand that pattern across millennia. Imagine a civilization not limited to regional trade, but operating across continents. Imagine infrastructure scaled to global coordination. Imagine supply chains stretched across oceans. Imagine information, systems that require continuous electrical and computational stability. Such a civilization does not merely risk collapse. It guarantees that when collapse occurs, it will be total. This is the paradox of advancement. The more a civilization extends itself, the less margin it has for error. Ancient cultures understood this intuitively. They framed their highest ages not as technological peaks, but as periods of balance. When balance was lost, collapse followed, regardless of sophistication. This is why ancient texts often describe prior civilizations as both advanced and doomed. They did not equate intelligence with permanence. They equated excess with instability. In this context, modern civilization is not an exception. It is an extreme case. Its energy systems are centralized. Its food systems are optimized for efficiency, not redundancy. Its knowledge systems are digitized and ephemeral. Its population density depends on uninterrupted logistics. Its infrastructure assumes stability as a constant. This is unprecedented, not in ambition, but in fragility. A single large-scale disruption in climate, energy availability, or information flow would not need to destroy everything. It would only need to persist long enough. Complex systems fail not because they cannot recover, but because recovery requires coordination that no longer exists. Once coordination fails, simplification begins. People revert to local solutions. Cities empty. Specialization disappears. The process does not look like apocalypse. It looks like attrition. Over time, advanced tools break and cannot be replaced. Knowledge remains but lacks application. Records exist but cannot be maintained. Memory compresses. This is how advanced civilizations regress into cultures that remember greatness without understanding it. Ancient accounts of lost ages are often dismissed because they attribute collapse to floods, fire, or celestial events. But these mechanisms are not primitive explanations. They are shorthand for systemic disruption. Flood means displacement. Fire means energy release. Darkness means loss of coordination. These are not myths. They are abstractions. When ancient texts say a world ended, they do not mean the planet exploded. They mean the conditions that supported complexity ceased to exist. This distinction matters because it reframes the question of the seventh civilization. If civilizations rise and fall according to structural limits, then numbering them is not arbitrary. It reflects observed repetition. The seventh is not special because it is mystical. It is special because by the seventh iteration, the pattern is unmistakable. Each cycle leaves less margin. Each rebuild occurs under altered conditions. Each recurrence accelerates. This acceleration is visible even within recorded history. Time between major collapses shortens. Systems grow faster. Crises propagate more rapidly. Recovery windows shrink. Modern civilization, compresses this process further by operating at planetary scale. If earlier civilizations collapsed regionally, modern civilization collapses globally. This is not speculation. It is consequence. And ancient cultures may have understood this better than we do. They did not attempt to prevent collapse. They attempted to prepare memory. They embedded knowledge in monuments aligned to the sky. They encoded time in numbers that could be reconstructed. They preserved stories that carried structure rather than detail. They assumed collapse would happen. The only uncertainty was when. Modern civilization assumes the opposite. It assumes continuity. It plans indefinitely. It treats collapse as an anomaly rather than a phase. If the ancient cycle model is correct, then this assumption is the most dangerous feature of all, because it removes preparation. And preparation, not technology, is what determines whether memory survives a reset. If humanity has passed through multiple, advanced phases before, then the difference between them and us is not intelligence. It is scale, and scale amplifies consequence, which raises a final, uncomfortable possibility. That the reason ancient civilizations appear mythic and fragmented to us is not because they were primitive. It is because they collapsed completely enough that only abstraction survived. If that happens again, the survivors of the next cycle will not remember satellites or servers. They will remember numbers, stories, and warnings, just as the Sumerians did. Ancient civilizations did not describe collapse as a surprise. They described it as a phase. What failed was never awareness of danger. What failed was the assumption that danger could always be postponed. The texts that survive from earlier cultures do not read like warnings issued at the last moment. They read like observations recorded after repetition had already occurred. They list signals, not prophecies, patterns. Environmental instability appears first. Seasons lose predictability. Floods and droughts intensify rather than alternate. Regions that once supported surplus begin to fail intermittently. These failures are not catastrophic on their own. They are disruptive enough to force adaptation, but not decisive enough to compel structural change. This is the first signal. The system compensates rather than reforms. Food is imported from further away. Water is redirected at greater scale. Energy is extracted more aggressively. Complexity increases to solve problems caused by complexity. The second signal follows quickly. Centralization accelerates. Authority consolidates under the logic of efficiency. Decision-making narrows. Systems that once had local autonomy are absorbed into larger networks. This appears as progress because coordination improves in the short term, but redundancy disappears. When redundancy disappears, resilience goes with it. The third signal is abstraction. As systems grow too large to be understood directly, they are managed symbolically. Numbers replace substance. Representations replace reality. Value detaches from physical constraints. This is not corruption. It is compression. Complex systems can only be controlled through abstraction. Ancient texts describe this stage indirectly. They speak of imbalance, of measures no longer matching weight, of calendars losing alignment with seasons, of rituals performed correctly while outcomes fail. The system still functions, but its indicators no longer reflect reality. This is a critical threshold, because when indicators fail, correction becomes impossible. The fourth signal is acceleration. Change happens faster than institutional memory can absorb. Adaptations stack before previous ones are tested. Infrastructure is built to solve immediate problems without regard for long-term interaction. Each fix introduces new dependencies. This stage feels dynamic, innovative, powerful. Ancient cultures often described it as an age of brilliance. It is also the point of no return, because acceleration eliminates pause, and pause is required for recalibration. The fifth signal is narrative fracture. Competing explanations proliferate. Consensus erodes. Shared meaning fragments. The same events are interpreted in incompatible ways. This is not because truth disappears, but because complexity exceeds comprehension. Ancient texts describe this as confusion of tongues, loss of harmony, or withdrawal of the gods. These are metaphors for breakdown in shared framework. Without shared framework, coordination fails. The sixth signal is overextension. Systems operate beyond their original design constraints. Cities exceed carrying capacity. Resource extraction surpasses regeneration. Maintenance is deferred. Risk is normalized. At this stage, collapse is often mistaken for mismanagement rather than inevitability. The final signal is silence. Not immediate destruction, but sudden absence of coordination. Communication fails. Trade stops. Specialized knowledge disappears within a generation. What remains is survival. This sequence is not moral. It is mechanical. Ancient civilizations did not collapse because they were immoral. They collapsed because they crossed thresholds without retreat. The Sumerians appear to have recognized this pattern already behind them. Their texts do not plead for salvation. They do not propose reform. They record. They understood that collapse was not something to be prevented indefinitely, but something to be endured intelligently. This is where modern civilization diverges sharply from ancient precedent. Modern culture treats collapse as unthinkable. Not unlikely, but conceptually unacceptable. It frames risk as something to be managed away, outsourced, or deferred. It assumes that scale and intelligence can compensate for structural limits. Ancient cultures did not share this assumption. They assumed limits were real. They built monuments not to glorify permanence, but to preserve orientation after failure. They aligned stone to stars because stone survives flood and stars survive time. They encoded cycles because cycles return even when cities do not. They planned for remembrance, not continuity. This difference matters more than technology, because technology increases speed, but does not change thresholds. Modern civilization exhibits every pre-collapse signal recorded in ancient systems. Environmental instability is no longer regional, it is global. Centralization has reached planetary scale. Abstraction governs economics, governance, and knowledge. Acceleration defines innovation. Narrative fracture is ubiquitous. Overextension is normalized. None of this requires belief in ancient gods or lost civilizations. It requires only systems theory. When ancient texts say a world ended, they are not describing a dramatic moment. They are describing the point at which complexity exceeded recoverability. From that point on, collapse unfolds regardless of intention. The unsettling implication is not that collapse is imminent. It is that collapse is not optional. It is a phased transition. And transitions do not negotiate. This is why ancient cultures focused on cycles rather than endpoints. They did not ask how to stop the wheel. They asked how to remain conscious while it turned. If modern civilization is the seventh iteration to reach this level of complexity, then the significance is not the number itself. The significance is that by now the pattern should be unmistakable. Which raises the final question the Sumerians never answered directly, but structured their entire worldview around. Not whether collapse will occur, but what, if anything, should be carried through it. When ancient civilizations looked beyond their own lifespan, they did not attempt to preserve everything. They made selections. This is the most overlooked detail in the entire discussion of cycles. If collapse were unexpected, preservation would be chaotic. Instead, what survives from earlier cultures is strangely consistent across geography and time. Numbers endure, ratios endure, calendars endure, orientation endures. What does not endure are luxuries. Tools disappear, machines vanish, materials decay, but structures of understanding persist. This is not accidental. It suggests deliberate compression. Ancient cultures appear to have recognized that no matter how advanced a civilization becomes, The vast majority of its knowledge is non-transferable across collapse. Technologies depend on supply chains. Institutions depend on continuity. Written language depends on literacy. Even archives depend on climate stability. What can survive disruption are ideas that can be reconstructed. Mathematical relationships, geometric proportions, astronomical cycles. These do not require infrastructure to reappear. They require only observation and reasoning. This explains why ancient monuments encode mathematics rather than instructions, why they align with solstices rather than store blueprints, why they embed ratios rather than machines. They were not designed to preserve comfort. They were designed to preserve orientation. The Great Pyramid does not tell you how to build a society. It tells you where you are in time and space. Stone circles do not explain metallurgy. They track the sky. Ancient calendars do not record history. They reset it. This is the difference between memory and knowledge. Knowledge is contextual. Memory is structural. Ancient civilizations prioritized the latter. The Sumerians did the same in written form. Their tablets preserve measurements, lists, cycles, and chronologies. They encode rains in units tied to cosmic time rather than human lifespan. They preserve flood boundaries not as stories, but as markers. They were less concerned with how things were done than with when things happened. This distinction suggests that they believed future civilizations would be capable of rediscovering technique, but not of rediscovering timing. Technology can be reinvented. Cycles must be remembered. If this is correct, then the most important inheritance from previous civilizations was not advanced machinery, but warning. Not warning in the sense of fear, but in the sense of recurrence. That collapse is not failure. That collapse is not punishment. That collapse is not the end. It is a transition. What determines the character of the next cycle is not how high the previous one rose, but what it chose to carry forward. This reframes the question of whether we are the seventh civilization. The number is less important than the position. Late in a cycle, civilizations tend to preserve aggressively. They archive, digitize, document, and record everything, assuming that volume equals permanence. But volume is fragile. The more information depends on specific formats, the easier it is to lose all of it at once. Ancient civilizations did the opposite. They reduced, they encoded, they abstracted, they accepted loss and focused on what could pass through disruption intact. Modern civilization is doing the reverse. It is expanding storage while narrowing formats. It is increasing information while reducing interpretability. It is centralizing memory into systems that require uninterrupted energy, maintenance, and expertise to access. This is not resilience. It is accumulation without compression. If collapse occurs under these conditions, very little will survive in usable form. Digital records will decay silently. Archives will become inaccessible. Languages will fragment. Context will evaporate. What will remain are physical markers, patterns, and natural records. Stone, sky, earth. Exactly what ancient civilizations relied on. This is why ancient texts emphasize remembrance over preservation, why they speak of wisdom rather than invention, why they frame knowledge as something rediscovered rather than created. They assumed that forgetting was inevitable. The only question was what form remembrance would take. If modern civilization truly represents a seventh iteration, then it occupies a unique position. It has access to more information than any previous culture. It understands cycles scientifically rather than symbolically. It can observe Earth as a system rather than as a mystery. But it also depends on complexity more completely than any civilization before it. This creates a narrow window, a moment where awareness exists without corresponding preparation. Ancient cultures built for collapse. Modern culture builds for continuity. This difference will determine not whether collapse occurs, but whether the next civilization begins blind or informed. The Sumerians left behind records not to glorify themselves, but to orient whoever came next. They did not say, "We were the first." They said, "This happened before." They did not predict the future. They described the past in a way that could be recognized when it returned. If modern civilization fails to do the same, then the next cycle will begin where the last one did. Confused, fragmented, convinced it is alone in history. If it succeeds, then the next civilization may not need to reinvent the idea of cycles at all. It may simply recognize where it stands. And that recognition, more than any technology, is what breaks repetition. When ancient civilizations reached the limit of what they could preserve, they did not conclude their records with certainty. They ended with scale. Not answers, but perspective. This is one of the most consistent features across long-lived traditions. They resist finality. They avoid closure. Instead of telling future generations what will happen, they attempt to show them where they are standing. This is why so many ancient texts shift outward at the end, from cities to continents, from continents to the sky, from the sky to time itself. They understood something modern narratives often obscure. That meaning changes with distance. From inside a civilization, collapse feels like failure. From outside it, collapse looks like transition. From far enough away, it becomes indistinguishable from rhythm. The Sumerians wrote at the boundary between memory and forgetting. Their records do not read like origins. They read like resumptions. They pick up mid-cycle, already aware that something preceded them and something would follow. They did not frame themselves as chosen or final. They framed themselves as temporary custodians. This humility is often misinterpreted as mythology. In reality, it may be the most rational position possible when one understands cycles that exceed human timescales. No civilization that truly believed it was permanent would measure time in tens of thousands of years. It would not divide history into cosmic units. It would not encode its calendars in planetary motion. The Sumerians did all of these things. So did the cultures that followed them. Egypt measured dynasties against stellar risings. India embedded human ages within planetary cycles. Mesoamerica tracked time until it reset and began again. These systems did not emerge independently by accident. They emerged because earlier collapses taught the same lesson repeatedly. That civilization is not the story. It is a chapter. The modern world resists this framing instinctively. It prefers linear narratives because linear narratives justify accumulation. They reward expansion. They promise continuity as a default outcome. Cycles challenge this promise. They imply limits. They imply that intelligence does not guarantee survival. That technology does not guarantee memory. That complexity does not guarantee resilience. They imply that collapse is not an error in the system. It is the system. This does not mean collapse must be dramatic or sudden. Ancient records show that many collapses unfold quietly. Trade routes thin, maintenance lags, knowledge narrows. The visible symbols of civilization persist, even as the underlying structure weakens. This is why collapse is often only recognized in retrospect. From inside the moment, everything still looks functional. The Sumerians did not wait for functionality to fail before recording what mattered. They wrote as if they knew that surfaces deceive. They trusted cycles more than appearances. If modern civilization is indeed the seventh to reach this level of complexity, then its defining feature is not technology, population, or reach. It is awareness. For the first time, humanity can see its own systems from above. It can observe climate, energy flow, ecological thresholds, and network fragility in near real time. It can model risks that ancient civilizations could only intuit. This creates a paradox. The more we understand the system, the more difficult it becomes to believe that understanding alone is enough to change its trajectory. Ancient cultures did not attempt to outthink cycles. They attempted to align with them. They accepted reduction as part of renewal. They prepared not to prevent collapse, but to ensure that collapse did not erase everything. Modern civilization has not made that choice. It still behaves as though continuity is the default. This does not mean it is doomed. It means it is unprepared. And preparation, historically, has never taken the form of dominance over nature. It has taken the form of memory. What survives a reset is never the most advanced system. It is the most adaptable one, the most compressible one, the most legible one. Ancient civilizations left behind legibility rather than power. They assumed power would vanish. If the next civilization looks back on this one, it will not judge it by its machines or monuments. Those will decay. It will judge it by what it chose to preserve when faced with impermanence. Did it encode knowledge in durable forms? Did it leave orientation rather than noise? Did it recognize itself as part of a sequence rather than an endpoint? The Sumerians did not ask to be remembered as founders. They asked to be understood as witnesses. Witnesses to a pattern they believed had already repeated multiple times before them. If they were correct, then the most important question is not whether we are the seventh civilization. It is whether we are the last to forget that we are not the first, and whether this time something more than fragments will cross the boundary, not certainty, not solutions, but recognition. Because recognition is the only thing that has ever interrupted repetition, and even that, the ancients knew, was never guaranteed. They recorded anyway, and then they stopped, not because the story ended, but because the cycle would continue without them. What ancient civilizations understood, and what modern civilization still resists, is that history does not care about intention. It responds to structure. Systems behave according to constraints, whether those within them recognize the pattern or not. Collapse does not announce itself as an ending. It announces itself as continuity under stress. The reason cycles repeat is not because civilizations fail to learn specific lessons, but because learning itself is bounded by environment. Knowledge accumulates faster than conditions stabilize. Every civilization eventually outpaces the world that supports it. This is not failure of ethics or intelligence. It is a mismatch between scale and substrate. Ancient cultures encoded this understanding indirectly because it could not be transmitted directly. No society accepts that its peak is temporary while it is still expanding. No civilization builds its identity around impermanence. What ancient civilizations did instead was embed reminders where denial could not reach. They placed them in calendars that reset, in monuments aligned to stars that drift, in myths that repeat destruction without villain or hero. They removed blame from the equation. This is critical. Collapse framed as punishment invites resistance. Collapse framed as recurrence invites preparation. The Sumerians framed collapse as recurrence. So did every civilization that inherited their structure, even when the language changed. This is why ancient texts rarely end with hope or despair. They end with continuation, with lineage, with handoff. The present moment feels different only because it is experienced from inside the system. From within, every civilization believes it is unprecedented. From outside, they all look structurally identical. Dense population, high specialization, extended supply chains, abstracted value, compressed time. These are not modern inventions. They are late-stage features. What is modern is the speed. Acceleration shortens feedback loops. It reduces the time between imbalance and consequence. It creates the illusion of control while narrowing the window for correction. Ancient civilizations collapsed over centuries or generations. A global civilization collapses over decades. This does not require catastrophe. It requires interruption, energy disruption, climate destabilization, information fragmentation. None of these need to be total. They only need to persist long enough to prevent coordination. Once coordination fails, complexity sheds itself rapidly. This is why ancient accounts emphasize silence after collapse. Not screams, not fire. Silence. The absence of systems that once made noise. Modern civilization is louder than any before it. When it quiets, the contrast will be mistaken for suddenness. In reality, it will be delayed inevitability. The Sumerians did not predict this. They recognized it backward. They stood at the beginning of recorded history and wrote as though they were already late. Their obsession with lists, cycles, reigns, and numbers was not bureaucratic excess. It was defensive memory, a way to anchor continuity in a world they knew had already reset. If they counted civilizations, they did so not to elevate themselves, but to locate themselves. To know which phase they were in, to know how much time remained before conditions changed again. Whether the number was 6 before them, or more, matters less than the behavior that followed the count. They built as though collapse was inevitable and memory was optional. Modern civilization builds as though collapse is optional and memory is guaranteed. This inversion is the most dangerous signal of all, because when memory is assumed, it is never compressed. When it is never compressed, it does not survive transition. When transition arrives, the next civilization begins blind, forced to rediscover patterns already observed, mistakes already made, cycles already endured. If we are the 7th civilization, the significance is not that 7 is mystical. It is that by now, repetition should be obvious. The pattern has had enough iterations to reveal itself clearly. Civilizations rise when conditions allow complexity. They fall when complexity exceeds conditions. They leave fragments. The fragments are misinterpreted. The cycle repeats. This is not pessimism. It is scale realism. The ancients did not ask how to stop the cycle. They asked how to be legible to the future. They assumed someone would come after them, standing amid ruins, asking the same questions. So they left answers that could survive misunderstanding. Not instructions, not warnings, coordinates, where the sun rises, how time loops, when the year drifts, what numbers repeat. Enough for recognition. If modern civilization leaves anything behind, it will not be its data centers or its networks. It will be whatever can still be read without electricity, context, or continuity. Stone, sky, ratios, exactly what survived before. The question, then, is not whether we are the 7th civilization. The question is whether we will behave like one that knows it. Because every civilization before us believed collapse was something that happened to others, in other times, under inferior conditions. They were all wrong, and they all left records saying so. Whether those records are finally understood as warnings or simply repeated as myths will determine whether the next civilization begins at the same point again, or one step further along the cycle, not toward permanence, but toward awareness. And awareness, the ancients understood, was the only thing that ever slightly bent the arc of repetition, never enough to stop it, only enough to remember, only.